Dr. Patrick Rynn Hogan is a healthcare executive, scholar, and author specializing in public health, health systems resilience, AI, and global risk. He's CEO and co-founder of Prescient Healthcare, where he leads an AI-powered decision intelligence platform that acts as a virtual chief medical officer for self-insured employers and public sector groups. It integrates clinical, claims, and workforce data to spot emerging health risks early, measures their economic impact, and drives smarter, evidence-based interventions. Dr. Hogan also chairs CellBridge Science, which advances non-animal in silico methods to reduce animal testing and biomedical research through partnerships with academia and the NIH. In his new book, The Silent Pandemic of Antimicrobial Resistance, he explores why AMR is already the next global health crisis, exposing deep challenges in medicine, governance, and international cooperation, and calls for an integrated solution across science, policy, and operations. Please welcome Dr. Patrick Hogan. Can you kind of expand on what is antimicrobial resistance? And from your research, what evidence has convinced you that this is a significant challenge that we, as in, everyday people, the healthcare systems, the supply chain, why has it been so unrecognized until this very moment? Why is it important now to talk about this?
A great question, Tung. It's interesting that AMR, or antimicrobial resistance, has been around for decades, and as it evolves, it just becomes much more severe. And so the reality of the situation is we're having a significant amount of deaths currently relating to this disease state, which makes it one of a large area of what's causing fatalities, but it's also growing. And then the reality is, because it isn't just one causality, it can be multiple microbes, and it's associated with a lot of other areas that get classified in a different format, sepsis and UTIs and all these pieces like that. People are not always aware that it's occurring. And so the opportunity for the book was to just allow people the awareness that this is happening. It's getting more and more dangerous to have certain clinical activities at hospitals. That doesn't mean that the hospital isn't doing everything in their power to ensure the safety of its patients. It just means that with antimicrobial resistance, germs that in the past have been able to be addressed through antibiotics are growing stronger. And therefore, there's a challenge in terms of the experience of that. I mean, nowadays, it is quite possible to suffer and die from a UTI, whereas most people think of those types of things as fairly innocuous, but it leads to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and it leads to severe conditions of sepsis because of AMR. So that's why I thought it was important to publish the book, and appreciate your opportunity to share some of the thoughts on it.
And in your book summary that you shared with me, you kind of describe it as a system level failure. Can you perhaps expand on that a little bit to our audience? When we think of systems level failure, I mean, does this involve the entire supply chain from the food we eat to when we arrive to the clinic? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. And one of the causalities of why it's a system level failure is in multiple places. One, there's a tremendous amount of antibiotics, really about 60% of them are being used on animals and to make them healthier, to allow them to get to the table for us. And that causes us to ingest, antibiotics. And the opposite side is there is this concept of the existing hospital system, or the healthcare infrastructure that exists post-COVID, where so many rural hospitals, so many areas are suffering from kind of the care isolation, where there isn't a hospital anywhere near some of the more rural areas. And that means that if any type of condition happens, it's much harder to get care. So the last two pieces are related to this idea that antibiotics was discovered about 100 years ago, but there hasn't been a tremendous amount of innovation in the field because a lot of the higher reimbursements go towards other disease states, and it's very hard to get a profitable drug in the space, and therefore there's not a lot of innovation coming through the pathway because of that. So when you compile all these pieces, the danger of the infrastructure, the danger with an ever-growing kind of resistance of these microbes, and then you apply this concept of how do we deal with them, it's impactful. One of the places that kind of share relating to South Dakota is the idea that it's a state that is kind of at a moderate risk for this condition because of the infrastructure. The hospitals, there's some really great health systems within South Dakota, but then there's a lot of areas in the rural parts of the state where there's not as much access to care. And on the opposite side, South Dakota is actually one of the more moderate environments that are actually prescribing a good deal of antibiotics to its patients. And so that means that there is more of an opportunity for kind of that impact of the disease as people are taking a lot of these antibiotics already. It puts the state and the population a little at risk.
Certainly. And I think you hit a really good point there about just rural health in general. And I know like in South Dakota, not necessarily saying that South Dakota represents all of rural health, but our healthcare systems in South Dakota has definitely been addressing how do we provide care and making it more accessible for a state like South Dakota. I mean, we're talking a population of less than 1 million people statewide, with the Great Missouri River dividing us here. But you also kind of made an interesting point about innovation. And as I hear you speak about that, on one hand, I can only imagine that, with antimicrobial resistance as like a topic and within respective industries, whether that's agriculture or healthcare, when it comes to innovation, I mean, is this kind of like a ripe playing field for disruption, for new technologies, for new startups, to really kind of participate and contribute to, making antimicrobial resistance on top of mind for people, and therefore having better healthcare for others? What's your perspective on that? Is there any innovation that you've seen or you've participated in or supported? Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, that's a great question. One of the challenges and one of the intents of the book is to bring the topic, at the point where, in worst case scenarios, AMR could actually have as many deaths as cancer in the next 20 years. The idea, though, is that we're reliant a little bit just on a lot of other innovation areas, on some of the government and institutions to support that. South Dakota has been fantastic about driving reporting, and kind of the government has been very good at connecting their health department with the CDC and communicating these pieces. But the reality is there's a great deal of breakdown between communication relating to AMR. Even on the reporting side, most deaths are listed as sepsis or UTI or different exposures, which creates this idea that there's not a kind of an impetus for change. People are looking at it, and the hospitals are publishing, the data is showing, an increase, but they're not perfectly linked to AMR. And so therefore you have this challenge where these persistent infections and the danger to society is real, but reporting is very limited in terms of the communication of that. And so there is both opportunity for organizations who want to create, in the pharma side, drugs that can help us. And then there's also a great deal of opportunity on the data side, organizations to facilitate the opportunity with some of these health organizations in the states to properly communicate what's happening within the state. And so, if anything, I hope that the book is a small impetus towards driving these entities to recognize we have to do a better job communicating occurrences and impacts. Because again, nobody really wants to raise their hand. A hospital system wants to raise their hand and say, we're experiencing a massive increase in sepsis and massive, we've had much more deaths in UTIs and different failures like that. So again, it requires us to be transparent, and it requires better reporting, and also kind of innovation in the piece that you just touched on.
Again, we already kind of teased that, antimicrobial resistance is not just limited to, one institution or one facility or one pocket of society, but it also traces from agriculture and food systems. Can you kind of share a little perspective on that side of things, considering that, of course, rural health also means for the economy like South Dakota, we're an ag-driven state. So can you share some perspective on how antimicrobial resistance applies to our food systems and agriculture?
Yes, I mean, one of the challenges in this space is this industrial scale antibiotics exposure. And so, you have the widespread use of antibiotics in livestock and in agriculture, and you have high density of productivity production in the South Dakota region. I mean, that in itself is not a bad thing, but you do have this opportunity for environmental dissemination. Bacteria, residues enter the soil, the water, the runoffs. You have the opportunity for this kind of environmental experience relating to that. In some states, not in South Dakota, Pennsylvania, for example, they have tracked certain outbreaks associated with pig farming and things of that nature, based upon the manure and food chain and the global distribution. The opportunity is again, the agricultural groups are doing a great job at kind of protecting animal health, but awareness is a huge value, right? Being aware of the impacts of the environment. One thing too is, just in terms of, you always hear from a clinician that if you're prescribed a certain antibiotic, to take the full dose of it. And a lot of people are like, oh, I feel better, so I'll just stop. But when they do that, they leave the most persistent of the germs to kind of, subside inside your cells, that they become, in essence, antibiotic resistant because they weren't killed. You stop the antibiotics, and now they're allowed to flourish. And the next time, when you take the same regime of care, they may not be treated properly. So again, this concept of the connectivity of the entire process, it's both in terms of the kind of medicine that we are prescribed, the food that we eat, and the environment we live in. To kind of, it all creates this opportunity. Again, not to scare people, but it's just simply the awareness as America ages, as so many people start to get, as the baby boomers kind of exceed 65, as people can become older, 20% of the population in a few years will be senior citizens. They're at risk for kind of, so critical. As an example, if you are even having the smallest activities at a hospital, lots of times they will send a very long list of ways to be prepared, prescribe antibiotics before, recommend the importance of cleanliness before, full body antimicrobial washes and things like that. Sometimes for some of us who are used to the world of thinking the hospital is a perfectly safe environment, we might question, why do I have to do that? When you overlay this worry of AMR, you recognize that it's very possible for you to be bringing in microbes that will impact the hospital community. So that's why it's so critical. And that's why the entire environment, the entire ecosystem is so connected.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned to this maybe in one of our previous calls, but I was thinking of, as you're describing your book and, this kind of critical point of how we should be educating ourselves on antimicrobial resistance, I started jumping to, okay, so what are the solutions, right? Because for me, it could be, sanitizing all the doorknobs, making sure I got plenty of sanitizer in my hands. But can you kind of share some frameworks or solutions that you presented in your book, at least how we can get started on addressing this?
And so that's just the awareness. Like one thing that's so hard to imagine, but as things like E. coli becomes more resistant to uh, antibiotics, the idea of that type of infection of food poisoning becomes really, really dangerous to individuals. There, as I touched on UTIs, again, something that you might consider as fairly innocuous, but you're like, oh, how could this impact you? But people die over it, and so the opportunity to is one to ensure that when you're prescribed an antibiotic, you take it to the full regime. You take all the pills. Two is the concept of recognizing the importance of and the danger of food poisoning, of E. coli, of making sure that everything that you have, you're cleaning, and the cleanliness of that process, and as you just touched on, the importance of washing hands, washing those pieces. The idea of, if you're going to have any type of GLPs nowadays, people are taking GLPs to lose weight, to become healthier, but there's also the danger that's an injection. Are you using an alcohol swab to make sure that the area that you're injecting is clean, right? And so these things are small things, but it's the awareness, as you touched on, of it doesn't take much for an infection to proliferate. And what's so strange is we've become so adjusted to this world where antibiotics solve all wrongs. And we're entering a place again where a scratch on the hand, there was an incident in the Northeast where a woman scratched her hand and she nearly died because she ended up getting some level of microbe that was very difficult to solve. And so it's not uncommon for these types of situations to evolve quickly. And so the awareness and the activities that you touched on are critical to your own health.
So there's an emerging innovation community in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and the USD Discovery District has completed a construction spanning about 50,000 square feet. This facility is dedicated for high-growth bioscience and life science companies where they design custom lab and office and will build it. To learn more, please visit usddiscovery.com. Yeah, I think when you said the word proliferation, that really stuck with me. I can't remember who I was listening to earlier this week, but I think it was a professional advocating for health policy and so forth like that. And she said something along the lines of, at least in our Western culture, we've had this perception of like everything is okay in moderation, right? Oh yeah, you can have another bite of that cookie, you can have another Coke, but if you zoom out at the bigger picture, now we have all these small things that are not really healthy for us, but the critical mass of all those small things pieced together, we're effectively, affecting our health at the end of the day. And also, I think you touched a little bit on it previously, but I didn't know that you had such a wealth of experience on the data, right, on this side. I'm curious about your take on artificial intelligence, and is that kind of a component to, antimicrobial resistance? And what's your perception on that?
And AI is a tool, and it's a very valuable tool to impact analysis and impact understanding of these condition states. So it does accelerate a lot of the compilation of data. So it's a net positive. Where AI is going in healthcare is very advantageous for us all. And so the opportunity is, for us all to leverage some of these pieces. AI is becoming quite ubiquitous, and so it allows for an opportunity to become aware, right? Care protocols, modalities of health are available to us. In many respects, the AI represents a clinician at your beck and call. And so, my recommendation is always to take advantage of it. It's sometimes hard. Sometimes individuals are not comfortable asking their clinician every question. AI, although shouldn't prescribe or determine a pathway is very useful for understanding your options and then also understanding kind of what might be most beneficial for you. So again, I think it's a great thing in kind of like you touched on in moderation, controlled understanding what you're using it for and taking advantage of it. And so that's a big win. The opportunity, as you touched on, is this concept of recognizing that everything is interrelated, right? As we use antibiotics in significant amounts for animals, that leaves the things that remain with those animals as being potentially, kind of antibiotic resistant. And so therefore, you are now ingesting things or you're getting impact with things that have run the course of regular kind of antibiotics. And now you're ingesting things that may be much more correlated towards potential of superbugs or bugs that are resistant to a normal course of antibiotics.
Yeah. I think you shared with me earlier too that this would be your second book that you'd be publishing. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm kind of curious, and I'd like to, can you share with our audience a little behind the scenes? What kind of inspired you to write this book now and release it? Like, was there a moment in life where you're like, hey, the world needs to know more about antimicrobial resistance? Or can you share a little bit behind the scenes and how you got to this point?
Sure, no, and I've been working on the book for a number of years, and it's something in the book. I also call out certain condition or pandemics that have happened, and a lot of individuals look at the pandemic we just experienced, the COVID pandemic, as being, wow, that was a unique experience. But the reality is that process, that pandemic for the human race happens all the time. We had a massive pandemic in the Spanish flu earlier in the 20th century. You constantly have outbreaks in some of the lesser developed countries, and you also have this issue where these massive pandemics, which I do call out in the book, like the Great Dying for the Native Americans, the constant kind of issues with the bubonic plague that affected Europe and Asia, is these things are evolving with us. And so it's not a anomaly, it's actually a reoccurring process. And then, you and I have talked a little bit about this too, is that the world has become such a connected environment where, as COVID illustrated, you could be in China one day with potentially a condition state, and then 3 days later being in North America with that condition state. So therefore, the opportunity for impact, global impact, is so much more dramatic than happened before. And as an illustration, the Great Dying, which happened to the Native Americans, where nearly 2/3 of the population died from the 15th century to the 19th century, it just kind of illustrates what the introduction of certain germs can do to a society or to people. And so it's really illustrative of the need to recognize that we have to be prepared for these types of things. So that was kind of that gist. If someone walks away from the book, my hope is, not for them to be alarmed or fearful of the future, but just recognizing that it's a reoccurring process among society. And that rather than looking at it as, well, that anomaly will never happen again, saying, no, it's going to happen to my children. And that's going to happen to grandchildren. And so at least you can be open about the process and also allow for that intellectual rigor, as you touched on. Think about, how do I guarantee my safety and help myself be healthier?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the key word you said there was preparedness. At the end of last year, the USD Discovery District, we released a market study. And one of the sections of that market study was about pandemic preparedness. And it was actually very similar to what you just said. It's like a pandemic, even though, it's my first I'm 32 years old, so in my lifetime, this was a global situation. But as you just said, I mean, this wasn't our first, and unfortunately won't be our last pandemic. And the question is, how do we remain prepared? And of course, I mean, we could probably talk for hours about, what's going on the federal level, research funding, even on the state economic development level, again, to how do we prepare ourselves for these threats. And I guess another side note is it made me think of, I think in January of this year, our governor wrote in at his State of the State address, declared that national security will be South Dakota's next big industry. And again, that just reminds me of, how does the world of biotech, how does even the topic of, bioweapons and so forth, as crazy as that might sound, but again, how do we prepare ourselves in those instances where there are threats? Our audience for this podcast is comprised of people in state, of politics, healthcare leaders, education, and so forth like that. So as they pick up your book and they read it, what are some takeaways that you want them to have?
No, I think making the topic to be foremost in people's mind is the win. The concept of sometimes because this condition, this issue, is not something that is an immediate call to action, a call to arms, where people are sitting there and saying it's like COVID, it's like a certain disease that can be just directly identified because it has so many kind of uh, tentacles. There's that opportunity to be like, okay, well, I don't know if there's anything we can do. But for academics, the opportunity for the awareness is the study. For clinicians, it's the opportunity for hospital containment, investment in making sure that certain kind of pathogens are always, carefully monitored and addressed. For the state governments, it's the opportunity to continue to invest in proactive actions like it has been doing in terms of communication with the CDC, in terms of reporting, in terms of awareness of the process. One of the great things that's so impressive about South Dakota is it's consistently investing in its population, in the health and welfare of its citizenship. And I think it's a leader in that regard in terms of the work that it's doing on comorbidities and chronic conditions and different items like that. But again, to our point, this all comes together because as chronic conditions raise, your susceptibility to condition states raise. All of this is, everybody has an important role in this process. And as you touched on, the call out of organizations who are investing in this kind of pathway and pharma, and I know South Dakota is doing a good deal of work in terms of trying to encourage investment in that area. That's critical, right? Because the last thing we need is for a massive pandemic to erupt and not having the right care protocols available. So hopefully each individual who may read the book comes away with a different call to action, but simply an awareness. As you're a young man, but as you age, there will be more risks, more impacts to you, and your awareness of that situation as you're doing will, kind of guard you against maybe a future health condition. So that would be the big win.
Yeah. And again, I just want to say thank you. I mean, just what started was just kind of like an intro call maybe a month ago has led to this conversation. And I think that's where I'm incredibly grateful just to have these type of conversations with individuals like yourself, because that's how I learn, is to meet the experts, right? And just at least give me the opportunity to learn things that I may be ignorant to previously. Is there, as we kind of wrap up our conversation here, what other messages would you like to share with our audience? Perhaps something I haven't asked you, but I should have.
No, I mean, I think you did a superb job in terms of uh, correlating all these pieces together. The piece of where I'm so grateful is just the opportunity. Your audience is a very strong intellectual group. Some of them may have an interest in the work, which would be great. Some of them may hopefully have some impact where they recognize there's something I can do either in my clinical environment, in my role in academia, my role in kind of supporting investments to make all of Americans healthier, and also the globe, make everybody a little healthier. And that's when, as we touched on, there is a very much connectivity between us all, right? There's not something that we could say, oh, that this is occurring in Africa, this is occurring in Europe, and it's not impactful to me. Where health is concerned, everything is impactful to us. And so therefore, understanding what's happening and connecting those dots are critical. But I'm very grateful and humbled that you allow me to have an opportunity to have this discussion with you and continue on this discourse of ways that we can make everyone a little healthier.
Certainly. And then the final question I have for you is just to give you the microphone. Can you please share us with our audience? Where can we learn more about you, the book? Where can people purchase the book? This is your stage to promote it.
Thank you. And the book is on Kindle, but also on Apple and a lot of other different devices, so it can be done. That the actual hardcover is coming out in a month, so looking forward to that. I'm actually CEO of a company called Prescient Healthcare, and we actually provide a chief medical officer solution for self-insured and fully insured. It's a little bit of an AI tool that acts as a chief medical officer to give people guidance on making decisions for their organization and the health of their organization. So excited about that. Looking forward to continuing to participate in this evolution. You talked about the AI, revolution of bringing this type of data that's available to all people so they can make better decisions about their healthcare and the healthcare of the people around them. So it's a great time to be part of the conversation, and I appreciate everything that you're doing.